Hey guys. Tonight we begin with something a little fragrant. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe pull the blankets a little closer, and settle in. This is not a story of great battles or heroic victories. No. Tonight we drift gently into a world where people absolutely could have bathed, but very much chose not to. And honestly, they had reasons, not good ones, but reasons. So let your mind slow down, your breathing even out. And let's quietly step into a time when the concept of personal hygiene was negotiable. Now, when we think about history, especially Europe between, say, the late Middle Ages and early modern period, we often imagine castles, gowns, powdered wigs, and long corridors echoing with footsteps. What we don't usually imagine is the smell, but we probably should, because for a very long stretch of time, bathing was not just uncommon, it was actively avoided, not because people didn't know water existed. Rivers were doing just fine, buckets were thriving, rain still falling from the sky as usual, but bathing, that was suspicious, and this suspicion didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, it was tied to a genuinely held belief that bathing could make you sick. Warm water, they thought, opened up the pores, and once those pores were open, well, disease could just politely walk right in, which is a bit like leaving all your doors open during a mosquito convention. So instead of bathing, people focused on other methods, like changing clothes, or applying perfume, or just kind of hoping for the best. Let's start drifting towards some of the most enthusiastic non-bathers of all, the European royals, because of course they were. Let's gently float over to one of the most famously unwashed monarchs, King Louis XIV of France. Now, Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, was the absolute definition of luxury. His palace at Versailles was enormous, extravagant, and filled with all the finest things money could buy, except, apparently, a decent bathing routine. Louis XIV reportedly bathed very rarely, like a handful of times in his entire life, kind of rarely. Instead, he preferred what was called a dry cleaning method, which involved wiping himself down with cloths soaked in alcohol or perfume, which sounds less like cleaning and more like marinating. Doctors at the time actually advised against bathing. They believed it could disrupt the body's natural balance. And since Louis was surrounded by doctors, he listened. Of course he did. Instead of water, he used heavy perfumes, lots of them. Enough to make Versailles smell like a walking flower shop, with a mysterious undertone. And it wasn't just him. The entire court followed similar habits. Nobles would pile on scented powders, oils, and fragrances, layering scent over scent, like a very determined attempt to distract from reality. It's a bit like spraying air freshener in a room and hoping no one notices the actual problem. But everyone was doing it, so, socially speaking, it worked. Now let's gently drift a bit south to Spain. Here we meet another fascinating example. Queen Isabella I of Castile. Now Isabella is often remembered for quite a lot of things: politics, exploration, major historical decisions, but she also had a very specific claim to fame when it came to bathing. She reportedly said that she had bathed only twice in her entire life. Twice. Once at birth, and once before her wedding, which is a minimalist approach, to say the least. Now, to be fair, this statement may have been a bit exaggerated. People love dramatic claims, but even if it's only half true, that's still not a lot of baths. Isabella, like many of her time, believed cleanliness was more about spiritual purity than physical washing, and excessive bathing was sometimes seen as indulgent, even sinful. So instead, people focused on outward appearances. Clean clothes, neatly styled hair, maybe a bit of perfume here and there. Underneath, well, we simply choose not to dwell too deeply. Let's slowly wander over to England now, where things were not dramatically better. Enter Queen Elizabeth I. Now Elizabeth was known for her intelligence, her political skill, and her iconic pale face. She was also known for saying that she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. That was considered quite frequent at the time. And again, she wasn't alone. Bathing was seen as risky. People worried about contaminated water, about illness, about disturbing the body's natural state. So instead, Elizabeth relied heavily on cosmetics and perfumes. Her signature white face makeup was made from lead, which, as we now know, is not ideal, but it gave her that iconic look. Pale, smooth, and just slightly chemically concerning. And beneath all that, layers of clothing, heavy fabrics, tight corsets, all worn for long periods without washing. It's honestly impressive, in a very committed kind of way. Now, you might be wondering, what about regular people? Surely they bathed more often, right? Well, not exactly. Bathing habits varied depending on time and place. In earlier periods, like the Roman Empire, public baths were actually very popular. People gathered, socialized, and bathed regularly. But after the fall of Rome, things shifted. Public baths became less common. Concerns about disease grew. And over time, bathing fell out of favor in many parts of Europe. Instead, people focused on washing hands and faces, maybe feet. Occasionally, full-body bathing. That was an event, something done rarely, if at all. And when it did happen, it was often a group activity. Families sharing the same bathwater, one after another, which, if you think about it too much, becomes less relaxing. So maybe it's best not to. Let's gently float into another interesting detail. Clothing. Because clothing did a lot of the work that bathing didn't. People wore layers. Undergarments made of linen were especially important. These could be changed more frequently than outer garments, helping to absorb sweat and oils. So instead of washing the body, they washed the clothes, which is a creative workaround. Sort of like cleaning your phone case and hoping your phone feels clean too. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and over time, it became the norm. Now, here's where things get a little ironic. Despite all this avoidance of bathing, people were very concerned with cleanliness. They just defined it differently. Cleanliness was about appearance, about smell, about presenting oneself in a socially acceptable way. If you looked clean, you were clean, even if, technically, you weren't. Perfumes played a huge role here. Strong, rich scents were used to mask odors. Flowers, herbs, spices, anything that smelled pleasant. Rooms were filled with incense. Clothing was scented. Even gloves were perfumed. It was a full sensory experience, one that likely required a bit of imagination. And then, slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Scientific understanding improved. Ideas about disease shifted. And bathing started to make a comeback. But that's a story for later. For now, we stay here, in this softly scented, slightly questionable world, where kings ruled empires, queens shaped history, and almost everyone agreed that maybe, just maybe, water was best avoided. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, just take a moment to appreciate modern plumbing. Really, it's doing a lot for all of us. And as we continue, we'll meet more figures, more habits, and more quietly strange decisions that made perfect sense at the time. Because history isn't always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's just a little unwashed and strangely comforting in its own way. Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere a little less glamorous than golden palaces and jeweled crowns. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into your pillow, maybe let your phone slip gently onto your chest as your eyes get a little heavier, because tonight we're not visiting kings at their finest moments. We're wandering slowly through their cities, the streets they ruled, the places people actually lived, and, well, let's just say, they were not exactly fresh. Now, when we imagine old cities, medieval towns, early modern capitals, we tend to picture cobblestone streets, charming little houses, maybe a marketplace with soft chatter and clinking coins. What we don't usually imagine is the smell. But smell was kind of the main character, because for most of history, cities were not designed with sanitation in mind. There were no modern sewage systems, no garbage collection trucks, no polite little bins waiting on the corner. Instead, there was a system that mostly involved throwing things outside. And by things, we mean everything. Let's take a slow walk through a typical European city around the 14th or 15th century. You wake up in a narrow wooden house. The air is a little thick, not aggressively bad, just present. You step outside. The street is tight, buildings leaning slightly inward, as if they're tired of standing. And then you notice it. The ground. It's not exactly clean stone. It's a mix: mud, straw, scraps, and other contributions from both humans and animals. Because horses are everywhere, dogs too, and people, well, people didn't always wait for proper facilities. In fact, many homes had chamber pots, which sounds tidy. Until you realize what happened next. At some point in the day or night, those pots had to be emptied. And the easiest way to do that was the window. Sometimes people would shout a warning before dumping it. A quick look out below, if they were feeling generous. Sometimes they didn't, because why add extra steps? So walking through the street became a bit of a gentle gamble. Not exciting, just mildly concerning. Let's drift over to Paris for a moment. Now, Paris was one of the largest and most important cities in Europe. A center of culture, learning, and influence. It was also deeply committed to being messy. Streets often had open gutters running down the middle. These were meant to carry away waste. In theory. In practice, they moved slowly, sometimes not at all. So things lingered. The smell, according to various accounts, was strong enough to be noticed long before you actually entered the city, which is impressive. Paris also had a habit of accumulating garbage in public spaces. Piles of waste would sit, slowly blending into the environment, becoming part of the landscape in a very unambitious way. And yet, people lived their lives. They shopped, talked, argued, fell in love, made plans, all while stepping carefully. Let's quietly float over to London, because London, of course, had its own unique approach to being unpleasant. The River Thames was central to city life. It was used for transport, for trade, and also, unfortunately, for waste disposal, which meant the river was doing a lot of work. Too much work, really. As the population grew, so did the amount of waste being poured into the water. Human waste, animal waste, industrial runoff, all gently mixing together into one long, slow-moving problem. And during warmer months, the smell would rise, not dramatically, just steadily, like the city itself was exhaling. People noticed, of course. Complaints were made, but solutions were slow, because large-scale sanitation requires planning, and planning requires effort, and effort, historically speaking, tends to take its time. Now, let's pause for a moment and consider the animals, because cities were full of them. Horses were essential. They pulled carts, carried goods, transported people. And horses produce waste constantly. A single horse can produce a surprising amount in a day. Multiply that by hundreds or thousands, and you start to get a sense of the situation. And it didn't just disappear. It stayed on the streets, mixing with everything else. Pigs were also common. In some cities, they were allowed to roam freely, eating scraps, which sounds efficient, until you realize they were eating scraps from the streets, and then continuing their day. Dogs, cats, chickens. Urban life was very much a shared experience, a very interactive environment. Let's gently move indoors now, because you might think that escaping inside would offer some relief, and sometimes it did, but not always. Homes were often small, crowded, and not particularly well ventilated. Fireplaces filled rooms with smoke. Floors were covered with rushes, basically dried plants that could absorb spills and odors. Over time, those rushes accumulated things. They were replaced occasionally, not frequently, so the floor itself became a kind of historical record, layered, detailed, quietly persistent. Now, here's the interesting part. People weren't unaware of the problem. They noticed the smells. They wrote about them. They complained. But their understanding of disease was different. Many believed in the idea of miasma, that illness was caused by bad air. Foul smells were seen as dangerous, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. But the solution wasn't always to remove the source. Instead, people tried to counteract the smell with more smell. Perfumes, herbs, incense. These became essential tools for daily life. People carried little bundles of flowers or spices. They burned scented materials in their homes. They wore strong fragrances. The goal wasn't to eliminate odor. It was to compete with it, to create a kind of layered atmosphere where nothing was truly gone, just blended. It's a bit like adding music to a noisy room instead of turning the noise off. It doesn't solve the problem, but it changes how you experience it. Let's float gently into another corner of city life: waste management, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Some cities did attempt regulations, rules about where waste could be dumped, when streets should be cleaned, but enforcement was inconsistent. People had habits, and habits are hard to change, especially when the current system is simply easier. Throwing something out the window requires very little effort. Organizing a citywide sanitation system requires quite a lot. So progress was slow, very slow, and yet life continued. Markets bustled, bells rang, children played in the streets carefully. One hopes. People adapted. They learned where to step, when to step, how to avoid certain areas at certain times. It became second nature, A kind of quiet choreography. Move here. Avoid that. Don't look down too closely. Now, let's gently drift toward a subtle shift. Because over time, things began to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually. Ideas about cleanliness started to evolve. Cities began experimenting with better systems. Covered drains. Organized waste removal. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and something, in this case, was a meaningful improvement. So as you relax a little deeper, just imagine these cities, not as grand, shining capitals, but as real places, lived in, messy, slightly chaotic, full of people doing their best, within the limits of what they understood. And somehow, it all worked, not beautifully, not cleanly, but steadily. And as we continue, we'll wander into more corners of this world, more habits, more quiet oddities, because history isn't always about big events. Sometimes, it's just about how people lived, day to day, step by careful step, in streets that required a bit of attention. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little softer, a little slower, and just a bit unsettling in that very calm, distant way history sometimes is. So go ahead, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and settle into that comfortable position where you don't really feel like moving anymore, because tonight, we're drifting into a world where people didn't quite understand illness, but lived with it anyway, quietly, constantly, like background noise they couldn't turn off. Now, when we talk about the spread of diseases in history, it's easy to imagine chaos, panic, dramatic moments, but most of the time, it wasn't like that. Most of the time, it was slow, quiet, almost ordinary. People woke up, went about their day, ate, talked, worked, and somewhere in the background, illness moved gently from person to person, like a shadow that didn't rush, because they didn't know what caused it. Not really. Let's drift back to medieval Europe for a moment. Cities were crowded, streets were narrow, houses leaned close together, like they were sharing secrets, and inside those houses, families lived tightly packed, sometimes several people in a single room, warm, close, breathing the same air, which, as it turns out, is very convenient for disease. But no one knew that yet. Instead, people believed in things like bad air, or imbalances in the body. If you got sick, it might be because the air was unpleasant, or because your humors were out of balance, which sounds very organized, almost scientific. It just wasn't quite correct. Let's slowly float over to one of the most well-known examples, the time of the plague. Now, we won't make this dramatic. No sudden shocks here. Instead, imagine it arriving quietly. A ship docks, goods are unloaded, people move back and forth, conversations happen, coins exchange hands, and somewhere in that movement, something invisible comes along too. At first, nothing seems different. A few people feel unwell. They rest, maybe they recover, maybe they don't, but life continues, because it has to. And then, gradually, more people fall ill, not all at once, not in a single dramatic wave, just here and there, a neighbor, a shopkeeper, someone down the street. And because no one fully understands what's happening, people respond in ways that feel logical to them, not in a single dramatic wave, just here and there, a neighbor, a shopkeeper, someone down the street. And because no one fully understands what's happening, people respond in ways that feel logical to them. They avoid bad smells. They burn herbs. They carry little scented pouches, hoping to protect themselves, which, in a way, is kind of comforting. It gives a sense of control, even if the control isn't quite real. Let's gently move into the lives of the wealthy for a moment, because you might think, surely kings and queens had better protection. And yes and no. They had space, large rooms, big palaces, but they also had constant visitors, servants, advisors, guests, a steady flow of people, coming and going, and with them, the same invisible travellers. Let's float over to England and spend a quiet moment with King Henry VIII. Now Henry is often remembered for his personality, his decisions, his general tendency to do things his own way. But when it came to illness, he was surprisingly cautious. Well, cautious in his own unique style. Whenever there was an outbreak nearby, Henry would simply leave. He would move from palace to palace, taking his court with him, trying to stay one step ahead of whatever might be spreading. Which sounds practical, until you realize that moving a large group of people around the country might not actually reduce the risk. It might just relocate it. But still, it felt like action, and in uncertain times, any action can be comforting. Let's quietly drift over to Italy now. Here, cities like Florence and Venice were busy, vibrant, full of trade and movement, which also meant full of opportunities for disease to travel. Merchants arrived from distant places. Ships came and went. Goods were exchanged, and along with silk, spices, and coins came something less welcome. At first, people didn't connect these movements to illness. It was just part of life. Trade brought wealth, and sometimes other things, uninvited, unnoticed. Now, here's where things get a little quietly interesting. Because even without understanding germs, people started noticing patterns. They noticed that illness often followed travelers, that crowded places seemed riskier, that certain areas were best avoided. So they began experimenting with solutions, not perfect ones, but thoughtful ones. One of the earliest ideas was something we now call quarantine. Ships arriving in ports would be asked to wait, not forever, just for a while, 40 days, in some cases, just to see, to observe, to make sure nothing developed. It was a simple idea. Give it time. If nothing happens, it's probably safe. And if something does, well, at least it hasn't spread yet. It wasn't based on modern science, but it was surprisingly effective. Let's gently return to everyday life. Because while cities and rulers made decisions, ordinary people simply adapted. They avoided certain places, stayed indoors when possible, listened to rumors, advice, stories. Some wore protective items, masks filled with herbs, layers of cloth, not because they fully understood why, but because it felt like something. And sometimes, something is enough to bring a little peace. Now, let's float over to France again, because French courts, as always, had their own unique approach. When illness appeared, the court didn't panic. They adjusted. Gatherings became smaller, movements more cautious, but life didn't stop. It slowed, slightly, like a quiet acknowledgement that something was happening, without fully confronting it. And then, over time, slowly, gently, understanding began to change. Not all at once, but piece by piece. People began to connect cleanliness with health, ventilation with safety, distance with protection. Small ideas, growing steadily. But in the period we're resting in now, those ideas are still forming, still uncertain. So people continue as they always have, living, moving, adapting, while something unseen moves alongside them, quietly, patiently. And as you sink a little deeper into your rest, just imagine it, not as something dramatic, but as something soft, a slow-moving presence in the background of everyday life. People lighting candles, closing doors, whispering small concerns, and then continuing on, because that's what people do. So as we keep drifting, we'll meet more of these moments, more figures, more quiet responses, more ways people tried to understand something they couldn't see, and somehow still found a way to live with it. For now, just breathe slowly. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something oddly quiet and strangely comforting in a very distant way. So go ahead, dim the lights, loosen your shoulders, and settle into that soft spot where your thoughts begin to slow down just a little. Because tonight, we're stepping into a world where cleanliness wasn't exactly the priority. Not because people didn't care, but because they understood it very differently. And honestly, once you get used to the idea, it all starts to make a strange kind of sense. Now, when we think about cleanliness today, it feels obvious. You wash your hands, you bathe regularly, you keep your surroundings reasonably tidy. But for most of history, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, cleanliness wasn't about washing, it was about appearance. If you looked clean, you were clean, and that was good enough. Let's drift gently into a noble household. A large room, thick stone walls, tapestries hanging to keep out the cold, a fire quietly burning in the corner. It looks impressive, but if you stay there for a moment, just a moment longer than usual, you begin to notice things. The air is heavy, not overwhelming, just layered. Because windows were often kept closed, fresh air wasn't always trusted. Cold air especially was seen as unhealthy, so rooms stayed warm, enclosed, and everything inside those rooms stayed there too. Now let's meet someone who lived very comfortably in this world. Let's float over to France again, because of course we are, and spend a quiet moment with King Louis XIII. Now Louis XIII wasn't particularly unusual for his time, which is what makes this slightly more interesting. He, like many others, didn't bathe often. Water was seen as risky, potentially harmful. Instead, cleanliness came from changing clothes. Fresh linen undergarments were considered essential, so as long as you changed those regularly enough, you were doing quite well. The body underneath, well, it was doing its own thing, and everyone politely ignored it. Let's slowly move to another royal. Someone who took this idea and just lived with it completely. King James I of England. Now James had many qualities. He was intelligent, deeply interested in theology, and not especially concerned with personal hygiene. He reportedly disliked bathing, not just avoided it, actively disliked it, which, honestly, saves time. He preferred wearing the same clothes for long periods. And while others might quietly suggest a change, he was not particularly interested, because from his perspective, there were more important things to think about, like ruling a kingdom. Cleanliness, in the physical sense, just didn't make the list. Now, let's pause here for a moment, because it's easy to think, surely people noticed. And yes, they did. But here's the thing, everyone was living the same way, so nothing stood out. If everyone shares the same habits, they stop feeling unusual. They become normal. Let's gently drift into daily routines, because everyday life was built around these ideas. People woke up, dressed carefully, adjusted their clothing, maybe washed their face and hands. That part was important. Visible cleanliness mattered, but full body washing, that was rare. Not completely absent, just occasional, and often reserved for specific moments. Special occasions, medical reasons, religious preparation, not daily life. Now, here's where things get a little quietly ironic. Even though bathing was avoided, people were very concerned about smell, which creates a bit of a situation, so they found solutions, or workarounds. Perfume became incredibly important, not just as a luxury, but as a necessity. Strong scents were layered onto clothing, skin, hair, flowers, herbs, spices, anything that could provide a pleasant aroma. Rooms were filled with incense. Oils were applied generously. It wasn't about removing odors. It was about outnumbering them. If enough pleasant smells were present, the unpleasant ones might fade into the background, or at least become less noticeable. Let's float over to another interesting figure. Queen Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I. Now Anne lived in the same environment, the same cultural habits, but she had a slightly different approach. She enjoyed certain aspects of cleanliness, particularly when it came to appearance. She took care with her clothing, her presentation, her overall image, because in royal courts, how you appeared mattered deeply, even if what was underneath remained politely unaddressed. Let's gently shift to clothing again, because clothing was doing a lot of work here. Layers were essential. Undergarments, especially linen, acted as a barrier between the body and outer clothing. They absorbed sweat, oils, everyday wear, and they could be washed more easily than heavy outer garments. So instead of washing the body, people washed the layers closest to it, which is a very practical compromise. Not perfect, but practical. Now let's drift into sleeping arrangements, because this is where things get quietly crowded. Beds were often shared, not just by couples, but sometimes by multiple people, family members, guests, even servants, because beds were large and space was limited. And again, this wasn't seen as strange. It was simply how things were. Everyone adjusted. Now, let's float over to another royal. Someone whose life was filled with structure, routine, and just a hint of quiet discomfort. Philip II of Spain. Philip was deeply religious, very disciplined, very serious. Unlike many of his time, not particularly focused on bathing. He preferred order, clean clothing, controlled environments, but the idea of frequent washing didn't quite fit into his routine. Instead, he maintained cleanliness through careful habits, structured daily life, limited exposure, which sounds very organized and probably felt very reassuring. Let's pause again and notice something subtle. None of these people thought they were neglecting cleanliness. They believed they were maintaining it in their own way, based on what they understood, and that understanding shaped everything. Now, slowly, very slowly, ideas began to shift, not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. People started connecting cleanliness with health in a more direct way. They began to see the benefits of washing, of fresh air, of ventilation. But for now, in this moment, those ideas are still forming, still distant. So people continue as they always have, dressing carefully, applying perfume, opening windows occasionally, and living their lives in a world where cleanliness is visible, but not necessarily physical. And as you relax a little deeper, just imagine it. Soft candlelight, quiet rooms, layers of fabric, a world that feels calm, structured, and just slightly untouched by water. Not unpleasant, just different. So as we keep drifting, we'll meet more of these lives, more habits, more quiet contradictions, Because history isn't always about what people did. Sometimes it's about what they chose not to do, and how completely normal that felt. For now, just rest. All right, just settle in a little deeper. Maybe shift your pillow slightly. Let your breathing slow down again. Because we're continuing gently from where we left off. A world that looked clean, felt composed, and yet quietly avoided the one thing that might have actually solved most of its problems. Water, not completely absent, of course, just treated with suspicion. Like an acquaintance, no one fully trusted. Let's drift back into the rhythm of daily life. Morning arrives slowly, light filters through small windows. A servant moves quietly across the room, adjusting clothes, preparing garments for the day. Because getting dressed, that's where cleanliness really begins. Fresh linen. That's the key. A clean underlayer could change everything. It could give the impression of order, of control, of being put together. And for most people, that was enough. Let's float over to France again, because France never really leaves these conversations. And this time, we spend a quiet moment with King Louis XV. Now Louis XV lived in the grand continuation of Versailles. The same glittering halls, the same carefully choreographed lifestyle. Unlike those before him, he wasn't exactly enthusiastic about bathing. He preferred scent. Lots of it. Perfumes were applied generously, not subtly, not lightly, generously. Because if one layer of fragrance was good, then several layers must be better. And if something still lingered underneath, well, it would simply have to compete. Versailles itself becomes a kind of character here, because it looks perfect. Polished floors, expansive halls, beautiful gardens stretching endlessly outward. But inside, the story is a little softer, a little more complicated. With so many people living and moving through the palace, nobles, servants, visitors, keeping everything truly clean was nearly impossible. So instead, they maintained appearances. Rooms were aired, occasionally. Perfumes were burnt, clothing was refreshed, and life continued smoothly. Now, let's gently drift over to Austria and meet a dynasty that quietly took keeping it in the family to a very committed level. The Habsburgs. Now, the Habsburgs are often remembered for their very distinct look, a strong jawline, a certain facial structure that became more pronounced over generations, because of course it did. And while their genetic choices were an ongoing situation, their hygiene habits were not dramatically different from their neighbors. Let's pause with Emperor Charles II of Spain. Now Charles is often described as a fragile, physically, emotionally, just generally not having the easiest time. He struggled with health issues his entire life. Eating, speaking, even basic movements could be difficult, and in a world where bathing was already limited, his personal care was even more delicate. Servants assisted him constantly, managing clothing, maintaining appearance, but beneath all of that, there was a quiet reality, one where physical discomfort, limited understanding of health, and cultural habits all blended together, and no one really questioned it, because this was normal. Let's gently move back into the broader world, because outside of palaces, life continued in much the same way. Cities were busy, streets were full, people moved through their days with quiet routines, and cleanliness remained visual. Barbers played an interesting role here, not just for haircuts, but for grooming in general. They trimmed beards, cleaned nails, managed appearances, because looking neat mattered, even if deeper cleanliness remained optional. Now let's drift towards something a little oddly specific. Wigs. Yes, wigs. Because wigs became incredibly fashionable, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Large, powdered, carefully styled wigs. They looked elegant, impressive, and they served a purpose. They helped cover natural hair, which might not always be in the best condition, because frequent washing of hair, also not common. So instead, wigs provided a solution, a very elaborate solution. But wigs came with their own quiet challenges. They required maintenance, powdering, brushing, careful storage, and occasionally they attracted unwanted guests, tiny ones, which, again, we won't dwell on too much, because this is meant to be relaxing. But just know, wigs were doing a lot. Let's float over to England once more and spend a moment with King Charles II. Now Charles II was known for his charm, his wit, his lively court, and like many of his time, he embraced the culture of appearance, elegant clothing, styled hair, careful presentation. But when it came to actual bathing, he remained within the norms of the era, which is to say, not particularly frequent. Instead, he relied on changing clothes, using scents, maintaining the outer layer, because that's what people saw, and what people saw was what mattered. Let's pause again and notice the pattern. Again and again, the focus is outward, visible, controlled, because the inner reality was harder to manage, and so it was quietly set aside. Now, let's gently drift into something a little more subtle, medical advice, because doctors at the time weren't ignoring cleanliness. They just approached it differently. They believed the body needed balance, and bathing, especially in warm water, was thought to disrupt that balance. It could open the pores, let in illness, weaken the body. So avoiding frequent bathing wasn't laziness, it was caution, careful, well-intentioned caution. Let's float into a quieter scene. A noble woman preparing for the day. She sits near a window, light soft against the room. Her hair is arranged carefully, her clothing layered with precision. A servant brings scented water, not for bathing, but for gentle washing of hands and face. A small ritual, controlled, limited, but meaningful. And that's the thing. These small acts, they mattered. They created a sense of order, of care, even in a world where full cleanliness, as we understand it, wasn't fully present. Now, slowly, almost imperceptibly, change begins to approach. New ideas, new observations. People start to notice that water might not be the enemy, that cleanliness might go deeper than appearance. But these ideas take time. They don't rush. They drift in, slowly, like everything else in this world. So for now, we remain here, in this quiet balance between effort and avoidance, between care and habit, a world where people did what they believed was right. Even if it seems a little strange from where we sit now, and as your thoughts begin to soften again, just let that image settle. Soft fabrics, gentle routines, the faint scent of perfume in the air, a world that looks composed, feels calm, and quietly avoids asking too many questions. We'll keep drifting, slowly, into more lives, more habits, more of these gentle contradictions, because history doesn't rush.